Alrighty. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening for a very special program. My name is Avinoam Patt, and I'm the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies at the University of Connecticut, where I also serve as the Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. Many thanks to our co-sponsors, the Aleph Institute of Jewish Ideas at the Jewish Community Foundation of Greater Hartford, the Mandel Jewish Community Center, Voices of Hope, and the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Hartford, as well as Howard Rosenbaum and Congregation Beth Israel for hosting our event this evening on their Zoom account. I want to thank our excellent panelists, who I will introduce in a moment, including Susan Herbst, for first suggesting that we organize this program. This program will be recorded, so if you know anyone who is unable to join now, we will be sharing a link to the event afterwards. We are indeed living in a time that is frightening and really without precedent in our lifetimes. And I want to acknowledge the courageous efforts of all of our healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals, first responders, and more. Indeed, all of those working on the front lines to sustain us in these times for their truly heroic efforts.
I think we're getting somebody trying to crash this.
Lost you.
We wish them a great success. Sei gesund und stark. Our panel will each have a few minutes for opening remarks, followed by a discussion that I will moderate, and then time for Q&A at the conclusion of the program. For the Q&A, as the audience will be muted, questions can be asked in the chat box. You can access the chat box by hovering over the bottom of your screen. Click on the chat functions, ask your questions to everyone, not in a direct message to someone because they won't be able to read it. And if you have a question you want to direct to someone specific, you can state that in the question line. One caveat, our goal is to keep this event to approximately 75 minutes. So if we go over that, we may not get to all questions. Please keep your comments relevant and appropriate for the program. Now, a little bit of background on this discussion. Philip Roth published The Plot Against America in 2004, imagining an alternative history where in the election of 1940, the American public decided not to grant FDR an unprecedented third election, instead electing the isolationist aviation hero Charles A. Lindbergh to become president of the United States. Lindbergh, in turn, formed an alliance with Nazi Germany, fulfilling his campaign promise to stay out of the war, and things got much worse for Jews in America. Roth reimagines this alternate history from the perspective of a young Philip growing up in the Wequahic neighborhood of Newark, experiencing this increasingly terrifying turn of events. We are here to discuss the novel and the recent adaptation on HBO created and produced by David Simon. Many of you may know his work on The Wire, which closely follows Roth's novel, but with some important distinctions. This is also the point to say that if you have not seen the show and do not want spoilers, you should click away now and watch the recording of this program later. We will discuss every aspect of the novel and the show, and I promise you we will give away the ending as well. Now, to introduce this distinguished panel of literary scholars, political scientists, and historians. And I'm going to introduce everyone now, and then they will each have some time to speak before we go to the Q&A. Victoria Ahrens. So Victoria Ahrens holds the position of O.R. and Eva Mitchell Distinguished Professor of Literature at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, where she teaches courses on American, Jewish, and Holocaust literature, in addition to being the author of over 80 scholarly articles and book chapters. She's the author-editor of 11 books, including her most recent monograph, Holocaust Graphic Narratives, Generation, Trauma, and Memory, published by Rutgers in 2020. She's on the editorial board of Philip Roth Studies, Studies in American Jewish Literature and Women in Judaism, and she is the series editor for Lexington Studies in Jewish Literature. Welcome, Victoria Ahrens. Susan Herbst is University Professor of Political Science and President Emeritus at the University of Connecticut. She is the author of many books and articles about the history of American public opinion and media from the 19th century to the present day. Her current book project concerns the nature of political discourse and opinion measurement in the United States during the 1930s. Welcome, Susan Herbst. Stuart Miller serves as the academic director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at UCONN and is professor of Hebrew, History, and Judaic Studies at the university's Department of Literatures, Cultures, and Languages. He's a specialist in the history and literature of the Jews of Greco-Roman and late antique Palestine. His first book, published in 1984, was on the renowned capital of ancient Galilee, Sepphoris or Tzipori, and he has an interest in matters both ancient and modern, especially as they pertain to the maintenance of Jewish identity and the role the family and the home have played in the survival of Jews and Judaism, which is the theme of a book he is now working on. His ancient and modern interests converged in 2012 when he co-directed a UConn-sponsored excavation of a ritual bath dating to the turn of the 20th century in Chesterfield, Connecticut, the state's oldest Jewish farming community. He teaches a popular survey course called Who Are the Jews? Jewish Identity Through the Ages. And most pertinent for this evening's program, he is a proud Newarker, is that the right way? A Newarker, who grew up not far from where Philip Roth spent his youth, albeit just a few decades later. And finally, our last speaker this evening will be Aimee Pozorski. Aimee Pozorski has authored Roth and Trauma, The Problem of History in the Later Works, Falling After 9/11, Crisis in American Art and Literature, and AIDS, Trauma, and Politics. She has edited or co-edited volumes on the topics of Philip Roth, American modernism, and HIV/AIDS representation. Her areas of expertise include contemporary American literature, transatlantic modernism, theories of trauma and ethics, and narrative medicine. She co-edits, along with Maren Scheuer, the peer-reviewed journal Philip Roth Studies. She is professor of English at Central Connecticut State University, where she also directs the English graduate program and co-directs the program in American Studies. So welcome to all of our panelists. We'll proceed in the order that you can see on the screen in front of you, that is alphabetical order. So I'm going to stop my screen share in a moment, and Victoria Ahrens will get us started. All right, go ahead, Vicki.
Thank you, Avi. And thank you, Susan, for arranging this. Welcome, everyone, to the Plot Against America virtual discussion. And I thought I would begin with some brief opening remarks on Roth and the origins of the novel that gave rise to David Simon's HBO adaptation. And Philip Roth, of course, is a major figure, and I don't need to say this to anyone in this audience, is a major figure in American letters and one of the most influential post-war American Jewish writers who, along with Saul Bellow and Bernard Malamud, created new possibilities for Jewish literary expression in America. Roth was born in Newark, March 19th, 1933, and he died on May 22nd, 2018. His parents were second-generation Americans. They were born in the United States. Roth's grandparents came from Eastern Europe. They fled the pogroms and came to America during the first great wave of Jewish immigrants in the late 19th century. That Roth was born in 1933 is not insignificant for our discussion. The year that Hitler came to power, escalating anti-Semitism, igniting fascism and genocide, and the systematic murder of millions. Thus, Roth grew up under the shadow of the monstrous events taking place in Europe during his formative childhood years. It's also not surprising that Roth turns to those years in his 2004 novel, The Plot Against America, since Roth remained throughout his literary career the voice of American cultural, intellectual, and literary conscience. Roth referred to The Plot Against America as a thought experiment. In the novel, Roth creates an America that never really existed, but one that could have, given the right circumstances. The plot against America is thus a uchronia, an allo-history, or alternate history, a hypothetical time period of our world, not as it was, but as it might have been. A matter of, as Roth once wrote, disarranging the historical past. In a piece titled My Uchronia that Roth published initially in 2004, the year of the publication of the novel, he writes this of the impetus for the novel, and I wanted to read this to you because this is how the novel got started. Roth says, in December of 2000, I was reading the bound proofs of American historian Arthur Schlesinger's autobiography and found myself especially interested in his description of the events of the late 30s and 40s as they impinged on his life as a young man traveling in Europe and then back home in Cambridge, Mass. They had impinged on my life too, though I was only a small child at the time. The great world came into our house every day through the news reports on the radio that my father listened to regularly, and the newspapers that he brought home with him at the end of the day, and through his conversations with friends and family, and their discernible anxiety over what was going on in Europe and here in America. Even before I started school, I already knew something about Nazi anti-Semitism and about the American anti-Semitism that was being stoked by eminent figures like Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh, who in those years were among the most famous international celebrities of the century. In his autobiography, I came upon a sentence in which Schlesinger remarks that there were some Republican isolationists who wanted to run Lindbergh for president in 1940. That's all there was, that one sentence with its reference to Lindbergh and a single fact about his political prominence that I'd not known. It made me think, what if they had? And with a pen, I noted the question in the margin. Between writing down that question and finishing the book, there were 3 years of work, but that's how the idea came to me for the plot against America. To tell the story of Lindbergh's presidency from the point of view of my own family was a spontaneous and immediate choice. To alter the history by making Lindbergh America's 33rd president while keeping everything else autobiographically close to the factual truth, that was the contour of the job as I saw it. I wanted to make as authentic as I could the atmosphere of the moment, to contrive a reality as believably American, even if I was giving our 20th century a twist that it had not taken. Why did I choose Lindbergh? I wanted America's Jews to feel the pressure of a genuine, widespread anti-Semitic threat, not merely at the personal level, but as a pervasive, insidious, native menace capable of emerging anywhere. As Roth cautions, all assurances are provisional. And appropriately, the novel opens with this ominous line: fear presides over these memories, a perpetual fear. And indeed, the plot against America is propelled, as the narrator says, by the terror of the unforeseen and our powerlessness in the face of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Let me turn it over now to Susan Herbst. Go ahead, Susan. Oh, let me make sure you're unmuted.
Make sure you unmute yourself.
Okay, how's that?
Great.
Thanks, Avi. Thanks everyone for being here today. I'm really glad to be here. I'm not a literary critic. I'm just a big fan of Philip Roth, who is such a wonderful writer and a thinker. And I know we're here to discuss The Plot Against America, but I just want to recommend, since people have some time on their hands these days, his last novel, his very last novel. It's called Nemesis, and it's gripping. It's a very elegant little book about the polio epidemic, and especially, I think, relevant and moving in our current circumstances. So that's your next assignment. Got a bunch of professors here. Let me raise just 3 points about Plot Against America, the book and the HBO production. And I think they match up fairly well, except for the endings, of course, with the television series being much, much darker. So first, about being American. Herman's feelings about his nation and Jews as citizens in his nation are obviously very strong. He's a passionate guy. His pride is it's ferocious, and he starts out in the series very clear-headed. He's an American family man. He's in a stable neighborhood there in Newark, and the neighborhood seems very American. It's optimistic. It's inclusive. It's very settled. And his feelings of being secure are pretty understandable. So there was anti-Semitism in the early 30s, throughout the 30s and the 40s, of course. But Jews in the United States were a pretty mature community by 1940, when the action starts to take place. So many Jews in America had immigrated from Europe decades earlier, in the latter half, especially the 19th century. And so they found success in a lot of industries by the time you saw Herman and Bess. They even built the studio system out in Hollywood. That's our dream machine. That Hollywood, taught us then and still teaches America what it's supposed to be. Hollywood is our great mirror of ourselves. Think about the classic film of Herman's time, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. That's a 1939 portrait of America. It was an extraordinarily popular movie at the time in 1939, 1940. It's a movie that Herman and Bess and everybody in the neighborhood would have seen. And it's about the resilience of American institutions. Remember, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It celebrates the common citizen. It's Jimmy Stuart, and celebrates public opinion in face of anti-democratic forces of corruption and graft. And I can just imagine Herman's heart swelling with pride walking out of that movie, holding Philip's hand. It was G-rated for sure, believing that that Herman was part of this fantastic imagined America. A lot of Jews like Herman thought they were already inside the tent with regard to American citizenship. They'd been here a while. Again, it was a mature community. A lot of them, many of them had served bravely in the First World War, and they enjoyed a lot of opportunity in the United States. But among the most brutal parts of the book and the film are how Roth turns Herman's world upside down. Roth really blows up, and I think this is his clear intention, the whole notion of what it is to be an American, and just how fluid that whole idea is, that whole construct of who is American and who's really not. For Roth, claiming to be American is not really a cut and dry matter. Far from it. What it is to be an American is always changing and can change very rapidly. Herman is so far gone through most of the film that he doesn't see it. He can't accept it. He can't accept the fact that he's on the margins, that his family, Herman hangs onto his ideals, though, for most of the series, Mr. Smith, but you get the distinct feeling that Herman will not triumph at all. I think, in my opinion, he'd be best to head to Canada, which is portrayed as more tolerant and more American than America. So even if FDR squeaks out a victory, at the end of Plot Against America, anti-Semitism is strong. It's not going away. Bess knows it, his wife knows it, and Herman just needed to be banged on the head with a 2x4, to see the anti-Semitism that was all around. Second point, Roth is absolutely brilliant, I think, in using Lindbergh as Roosevelt's opponent. He was undoubtedly an American hero of the highest caliber at the time. For a political scientist like me, the TV series is really interesting in that it's all about electoral politics, but not really about partisanship at all. So the drama of Plot Against America is really pinned to this national election outcome, which will either save the Jews from anti-Semitism by re-electing FDR or not. Roth makes it a very stark choice, and it's not really about two parties. I don't think there's much talk at all in the book either about Democrats or Republicans. In the Plot Against America, in Roth's imagination, there are really only two parties. They are the good people and the anti-Semites. So I think it's very clever how Roth replaces the party system with his own dichotomous system. It's like a parallel universe, just as tribal as Democrats and Republicans, but much scarier. So like today, where our politics are absolutely tribal, you're either a Democrat or Republican, you either watch MSNBC or you watch Fox. In the Plot Against America, you can't be neutral, you can't be a centrist, it's one or the other. So those are his imagined political parties. Third point, last point, there's a subfield in political science that used to be very popular called political socialization. And it's the study of how people's political attitudes and their social attitudes change over the course of their lifespan. One of the reasons that it fell out of favor, it's just really expensive research to do because you have to collect data on people, interview people every year or so for 70, 80 years. So it's hard to get that kind of thing funded. But we do have some evidence from panel studies that we have, is that, and here's how it kind of sums up, is that children tend to go against their parents ideologically in terms of politics as teenagers into their 20s, but most often as they get older and older, children boomerang back to their parents' ideology as they age. So think about that for your own circumstance, or you can see what's coming. And I thought a lot about this research during the Plot Against America because I wondered what kind of men Sandy and Philip might become with such an incredibly passionate, politically aware, ideological father like Herman. Just over the 6-hour film, the HBO series, Sandy goes through the whole route of this kind of political socialization, from opposing his parents initially, and then, you know, over the course of the film, seeing very painfully, you know, just how right Herman is to be opposed to Lindbergh, to be scared of Lindbergh. So it's a kind of a compressed and really traumatic transformation for a teenager at lightning speed, but it really does nicely capture the general trajectory of political attitudes as somebody grows up and separates from their parents, what their parents believe, but at the end come back home, come back to what their parents believe. So that's all I have time for. Thanks again for listening and for being here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Susan. So I'll just ask all the speakers if you can mute yourselves when you're not speaking, and maybe that'll help with our static issue in the background. So I'm going to turn it over now to Stuart Miller as our next speaker. And Stuart, now you'll have to unmute yourself. Hold on, Stuart. Okay, now you're unmuted. I'm going to share your slides.
Hold off on those.
Okay, let me know when.
Yeah, I'll let you know when. Okay, I apologize in advance. My comments are a little bit longer than the two previous speakers, and I have a few slides to show. I'm always struck when reading Roth's works how well he remembers the old neighborhood, by which I mean Weequahic, or as we Newark natives called it, Weequahic, I would like to share with you some reflections about Jewish life in Newark and Weequahic that will hopefully enable a more critical assessment of the meaning of Jewishness depicted in both the film and plot of Plot Against America, and in both the book and film Plot Against America. Just as I have utilized Talmudic literature for insights into life in the ancient Jewish capital of the Galilee, Tzipori, I read Roth as a window into Newark. Both the ancient rabbis and Roth situate their lives and observations in a context of a world they knew well, but have no intention of relating history. Thus, Roth's comments about Newark, like those of the ancient rabbis, require critical evaluation in order to determine their usefulness for reconstructing the social history of the Jews. Much has been written about Newark's Jews. In 1999, well-known sociologist William Helmreich published The Jews of Newark and Metro West, The Enduring Community. Tragically, Professor Helmreich passed away just a few weeks ago, a victim of COVID-19. I like his subtitle, The Enduring Community. As Avi indicated, I am fascinated by the dynamics of Jewish survival, in particular, the role of home and family in adapting to new circumstances. Another important work is Warren Grover's 2017 Nazis in Newark, which documents the inroads of the German-American Bund in 1930s Newark, of which Roth was evidently very aware. Linda Forgash's 2008 Jews of Weequahic is a wonderful collection of images of the Jewish community. Finally, I would like to note the fine work of the Jewish Museum of New Jersey, which is located in the Ahavas Shalom Synagogue in North Newark, a synagogue where my dad served as president before I was born. Here I would like to give a shout out to fellow Newarker Phil Urish, the vice president of the museum, who answered a number of questions I had while preparing my comments. Before turning to my main theme, I would like to briefly relate some random observations about various scenes in the film, much of which may not have resonated with viewers or even readers of Roth who are unfamiliar with Newark's rich Jewish past. Even though many of the scenes were filmed in Jersey City and elsewhere, the attention to detail was extraordinary. From getting the bus route numbers right, Hanes department store, street signs, even horseback riding in Weequahic Park. I must add, however, I do not recall ever seeing any rabbis riding horses in the park. If you remember, Rabbi Bengelsdorf is riding a horse. For my neighbors from West Hartford who might be in attendance this evening, Tabashnik's was sort of a crown market. Jack Tabachnik, the Herring King, as he was known, relocated his store from Newark's 3rd Ward to Weequahic's Bergen Street, the bustling mile-long shopping area where you could do your banking, get a haircut, buy clothes, fish, and of course, kosher meat. Occasionally, the film's producer, David Simon, went to extremes to depict expressions of traditional Jewish life that do not appear in the Roth's book. In one scene, he portrays a storefront with exclusively Hebrew signage, Chanut Svarim, Mordechai Grossman Uvanim, Mamarim Datiyim, Mordechai Grossman and Sons bookstore, religious articles. I imagine Simon is portraying Rabbi Mendelssohn's Jewish bookstore, which, as depicted in the film, was originally downtown and was an Orthodox establishment. This became Rabbi Sky's Hebrew bookstore, which relocated around the corner from where Roth lived shortly after he moved out, and quickly became a meeting point for traditional Jews as well as many others. Roth must have known of the store's existence. Even if he did not, he must have had some sense of what it represented, a tenacious hold among at least some of his neighbors on their Jewish identity, which Simon's detailed storefront, undoubtedly more fitting for contemporary Brooklyn or Jerusalem, is intended to convey. This and my next observation serve as a nice segue to my main theme. In the film, young Philip and his friend Earl take a furtive bus ride to what appears to me to be the Gentile suburb of Maplewood. When Philip inquires as to where all the kids are, Earl responds that only in Newark do kids, meaning of course Jewish kids, play ball in the street, something you see in the film. Well, I spent many years playing stickball, stoopball, touch football, and punchball on the streets of Newark, which was a highlight of any kid from Weequahic's childhood. Indeed, I think Roth got a little carried away in having to send Sandy off to Kentucky, where he gets to taste pork. Dispatching a kid from Weequahic in the summer, even to a Jewish overnight camp, would have been sufficient enough of an exile. As for the pork, In his school days, Roth was friends with the son of Abe Strulowitz, one of the many Orthodox kosher butchers in Newark. My sense is that you really had to go out of your way to procure treifa meat in Weequahic. Which brings me to my point. Roth depicts a Newark in which middle-class Jews are thoroughly at home with American life. However, there was a counter-dynamic among East European Jews in mid-20th century America that Jonathan Sarna describes as a, quote, accommodation and resistance. Roth's neighborhood was replete with Orthodox synagogues, usually referred to by their street name, Schley Street Shul, Wainwright Street Shul, etc. Avi? Asking Avi to share the screen.
Do you see that, Stuart? No?
I don't see it. Does everybody else see it? That's all that really matters. I know what it says.
Yeah. So I'm showing the
So the
slide
first-
that says 30 synagogues in Newark in 1940.
Right, I guess I don't want to switch to it because I'll lose everybody else. Anyway, yes, that first slide has a list of about 30 synagogues, I think, in 1940, most of which, if not all of them, were in existence before that. And most of them are Orthodox synagogues. Now, that does not imply that everybody went to these synagogues was Orthodox by any means, but it means that their preference was for a more traditional synagogue. The next slide. Is that up? So you can see
synagogues in Newark by decades.
Yeah, so it shows, I think, 1930 or 1940. The first one, 1930.
1940, 30
1940,
synagogues.
okay. So it says for the South Ward, 12 synagogues. Okay, the South Ward includes Weequahic. And then I was growing up in Newark. I spent almost the same amount of time in Newark as Philip Roth did. Late 1950s and the 1960s, and you can see the number actually increases in the 50s and the 60s of Orthodox synagogues in the South Ward. As the graph before you indicates, Newark had 30 synagogues in the 1930s, 12 in the South Ward, which included Weequahic. The Jews who frequented these synagogues are the missing Jews of Weequahic in Roth's works, yet they were central to the vitality of Jewish life in Newark until the community petered out in the late 60s. To be sure, Roth may have been impervious to the traditional life around him, but he certainly understood that assimilation had its limits. In his book, he presents the fictitious Rabbi Bengelsdorf as the antithesis of the very real and prominent conservative Rabbi Joachim Prince of Clinton Hill's B'nai Abraham Synagogue, who unfortunately only appears in a fleeting scene in the film. Both are German rabbis, yet the real Prince famously was banished from Berlin in 1937 after blasting the Nazis one too many times from his pulpit and getting arrested by the Gestapo. In the book, Roth lets us know that Rabbi Prince was the one rabbi who did not attend Bengelsdorf and Evelyn's wedding. In the film, at Evelyn and Bess's mom's funeral, Prince's eulogy includes a pointed response to Bengelsdorf's worldview. Quote, "Our parents are the generation that risked all to make us Americans. We are indeed now Americans." The real Prince would later summon collective Jewish past and his personal plight as a refugee at the March on Washington in 1963, where he was the last speaker before Dr. Martin Luther King presented his I Have a Dream oration. This is important. It is important because it suggests that Roth knew all along that the Jews of his era had a choice between accommodation and resistance. Bengelsdorf is the self-righteous American rabbi who wants Jews to feel even more at home in America, indeed more American, as he thought of Americans, to the point that they will be indistinguishable from the Goyim. But note the words of the anti-Bengelsdorf Rabbi Prince, who had this to say in his March on Washington speech. "I speak to you as an American Jew. As Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people about the shame and disgrace of inequality and injustice which make a mockery of the American idea. As Jews, we bring to this great demonstration, in which thousands of us proudly participate, a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of our history. In the realm of the spirit, our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, he created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. Not merely Black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act, from the president down to the humblest of us all, for the sake of the image, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. Avi, you may want to show the last slide. Joachim Prince,
Yes, it's showing.
at the March of Washington. He was, as I said, he spoke right before Dr. King. Abraham Joshua Heschel is known a lot more for his involvement in civil rights, but Joachim Prince was just as involved, if not more so. Rabbi Prince's vision of America is obviously one that makes no sense without the inclusion of the diverse views and particular experiences of the many peoples who built and comprise our country. While I wish that David Simon had given Prince a prominent role in his script, and that Roth had Chaim Potok's appreciation for the struggles of traditionally observant Jews in the 1940s, the plot against America brilliantly drives home that the manner in which we choose to preserve our identities and the right to do so is part and parcel of what it means to be American.
Okay, thank you so much, Stuart. And I'm gonna stop the screen share and turn it over to Aimee Pozorski to finish up our panel discussion. Aimee, can you unmute yourself? Okay, 1 second. Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Thank you so much. Thank you to Avi and Susan and Stuart and Vicky for including me in this exciting panel. I have a few remarks on the adaptation as it relates to the novel itself. So David Simon's HBO adaptation of Plot Against America is nothing if not an uncanny commentary on our current times. It is deeply frightening and frustrating during an already frightening and frustrating time in American history. As my fellow colleagues have suggested, it both is and is not based on history. It both is and is not political. It both is and is not based on Roth's life. It both is and is not a literal adaptation of my beloved novel, Roth's 2004, The Plot Against America. It is that last statement about the problem and potential of adaptation that I want to focus on during my brief remarks. Long a reader and writer who admires Roth as one of the greatest American novelists of the 20th and 21st centuries, I love this novel in particular because of its tricky perspective and its deeply detailed and engrossing, reflective, recursive sentences and paragraphs. In fact, the two, perspective on the one hand and recursive sentences on the other hand, work together in the novel. The very first paragraph announces what the novel is about. Vicky read it beautifully, so maybe for the sake of time, I'll just remind you that it begins with fear presides over these memories of perpetual fear. The opening line sets the tone and the voice, the child's perspective, with the intelligence and reflection of a grown adult. But mostly it is the child's incessant perspective of perpetual fear that propels you through all 362 pages, absorbing through the child's eyes, as in real time, the rise of Lindbergh to the traumatic family trip to DC, to newsreels of World War II, to Alvin's stump, to the nightmares about stamps having swastikas, to his aunt dancing with a Nazi, to his father crying with his mouth wide open, to Sandy's participation in the Office of American Absorption, to the Winchell riots, to his mother talking Selden through making dinner with what exists in the fridge. It is all narrated through the memory of young Philip with the hindsight of grown Philip. It is heartbreaking and recursive and raw, as if unfiltered through what is unfiltered is the expression of the persistence of trauma in the adult, not simply the traumatic moment of the child. The language itself reinforces the tone of the novel: fear, perpetual fear, terror's frightened boy. That is what this book is about. Then there's the incredibly overdetermined word presides in a book about a Nazi who comes to preside over the United States by means of a democratic election. Fear presides, fascism presides, leading you to wonder, how did it come to this? When watching the series, which much like the novel is structured by date, you begin to ask the same question. The America of 1940 is frightening, but it both is and is not recognizable in the America a few years later, with fires raging, riots, and the displacement of Jewish families. You can trace the series back scene by scene to begin to understand that for all of the promises of this country's ideals and founding documents, it can indeed happen here. But the pace and point of view of the series are radically different, and that changes, I would argue, your perception of the events. Shifting quickly between perspectives from Philip to Evelyn to Bess to Sandy to Elvin to Herman, viewers have insights into the motivations and emotional reactions of all of the characters. But this isn't quite the same as what readers of the novel access, the suffocating, fearful experience of a child's perspective through these horrific years. One of the benefits of shifting back and forth quickly from perspectives, however, is that the show telescopes the narratives of Alvin on the one hand and Selden on the other hand into close proximity. It allows you to see the effects of being orphaned and all of the connotation that word entails. In fact, through Simon's reading, we can see the work as an allegory that, like the figure of the orphan, worries about displacement and loss. As Philip says in the novel, "My father was a rescuer and orphans were his specialty." A displacement even greater than having to move to Union or leave for Kentucky was to lose one's parents and be orphaned. With the questioning of the American allegiance and patriotism of Jewish families and perpetual discussions about the need to move to Canada, the series helps us understand more clearly what is in the novel all along, that to be persecuted by your own country is to be orphaned. While the novel emphasizes Philip's terror and fear through the figures of the Stamps and the Stump, which are also prevalent in the series capitalizes on the power of fire and all of the ways it could resonate in a young boy's mind. Early in the series, Philip asks his father, "Why all the fire?" He's watching the news footage from Europe, sitting beside his father and Sandy. "That is war," his father and Sandy tell him, "modern war." This image comes back in the final episode of the series as Sandy and his father return with orphan Selden. This time, fire rages across the US at the hands of the newly powered KKK, empowered. It reminds us that US citizens have waged war against their nation's very own literal and figurative orphans. Almost exactly halfway through the novel, FDR refers to the plot against America as a plot, quote, "hatched by anti-democratic forces here at home, a plot to suppress the great upsurge of human liberty, of which the American Bill of Rights is the fundamental document, a plot to replace American democracy with the absolute authority of despotic rule." At the end of the novel, at least, this plot against American democracy has been thwarted once and for all, seemingly. The series, which shifts to an omniscient perspective as it sweeps the neighborhoods and states voting in the next presidential election, does not end so happily. In a week where the president's son-in-law floated the idea of postponing this fall's election, who can say whether the novel or the series is more salient in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you, Aimee. And I'm going to unmute all of our panelists so that we can all talk unless you can unmute yourselves. Great. Okay. And as a note to the audience, there's one question that's come in, which I'll ask in a moment. But if you do have questions, this is a reminder to please feel free to type them into the chat space, and we will try to get to them. So my first question for all of you is, you've all alluded to, and Aimee really sort of picked up on this point about how the shift in perspective is really prominent from the novel to the TV series. And I should mention, and Stuart pointed this out to me, that there is a wonderful podcast that's hosted by Peter Sagal, where he interviews the creator of the show, David Simon, that really goes behind the scenes of the process of adapting the novel into a TV series, and even some stories about going to meet with Philip Roth, essentially to get his blessing to do this. But as Aimee was noting, one of the most notable changes in the perspective of the novel, where you go from sort of the perspective of young Philip as a young boy and sort of the world that he perceives, to really 6 main characters, each with a different point of view, which is basically essential for a TV show to be able to tell a broader story. But I want to ask each of you, and Aimee already sort of alluded to this, but maybe we'll start with Vicky and go in the same order, what you think is gained and what is lost in this type of an adaptation from a novel to a TV series. Vicky, why don't you start?
I agree with Aimee that what I missed in the adaptation was this kind of doubling of voices. Because on the one hand, it is the novel itself is very much through the perspective of the young Philip, but as it is mediated by the older Philip. And so you get these 2 different perspectives, one where you're in the moment, that moment of fear, that moment of terror, the moment that you see from the young boy of confusion. I mean, in many ways, it's a coming of age novel. He's not the same boy at the end of the novel. He now knows too much. He knows things that he did not even imagine could be possible in the beginning. But I like the way in the novel, and I think this is the real strength of the novel, is that you've got that older guiding voice who now years later can look back and recognize the child that he was. However, I think that David Simon does that sort of without doing it explicitly. For example, I mean, you're absolutely right that we get this perspective through all these different characters in the adaptation, but I noticed over and over and over again, the camera goes to the young boy, Philip, and he's like crouched behind a door looking. He's sitting on the stairs, peering around. And so I think that is a gesture toward focusing on his perspective. And in many ways, you could argue that his father's perspective in the adaptation is that voice in many ways of the older narrator. But I think Simon handles it really well.
Susan, do you want to comment on that adaptation?
More for the literary critics, but as a viewer, I'll say that the child actor who plays Philip is a beautiful child and has beautiful eyes that he takes in the world with, and I think the director is very cognizant of, you know, his point of view, his eyes, getting you engaged in that, and it's hard to keep your eyes off his eyes, I guess is how I feel as audience.
Stuart, I'm gonna direct the next question to you, and you can also feel free to comment on the sort of the adaptation point, which you also raised in your remarks. But one of the things that comes out very clearly in both the novel and the adaptation is sort of this questioning of what it means to be a Jewish American, and whether to borrow Deborah Dash Moore's sort of the title of her book about second-generation children of immigrants, this idea that American Jews were very much at home in America. And Roth, both in the novel and certainly in the TV series, David Simon seems to challenge this idea of, how at home in America Jewish Americans really were. And so I think, Stuart, maybe you want to jump in and say a little bit about, what's your biggest takeaway in terms of a commentary on what it means to be Jewish American, and perhaps more broadly about what the Roth and David Simon's image of what it means to be an American is.
Yeah, I was hoping this question wouldn't come up, even though I touch upon it, because it's mixed up with the question of Roth's own Jewish identity. Vicki the other day noted that in our pre-discussion that Roth considered himself to be an American writer. And though I think that's true, what I'm saying and what I think, and I'm no expert in Roth for sure, even though I've read several of his books, is that I think that Jewishness never really leaves him, and he does struggle with it. And whatever he wants to call himself, it's everywhere. So and that's what I see in reading Roth. I think that he's contending with his own stuff. He leaves out and things that I think he should have noticed, and whether it was intentional or not, I don't know. Clearly his experience in Weequahic, some 20, 25, well, a couple decades earlier than my own, was different. But the elements of what I'm talking about, and I also have grandparents who came to Newark first, and my grandfather built a business with my father in Newark. We have a very similar experience. It's just a couple decades later, and I know about the earlier experience through the eyes of my parents and grandparents. So I think, Roth is a complicated figure, so I don't want to talk about his Jewishness. But the larger question, I find it's funny that you're asking me, because you're the modern American Jewish historian, and you could probably answer it a whole lot better than I can. But there's a lot going on during this period, and the direction in which American Jews are going in terms of their identity, whether their religious identity, their American identity in general, is a complicated story. And the story that was predicted in 1940s turned out to be very different, with a whole influx of increasing influx of Eastern European Jews after the Holocaust, and the direction seemingly moving towards a very strong conservative Jewish movement, which there was for a period of time, and with the Orthodox seeing no hope on the horizon. That was the prediction of sociologists at the time. So predictions are hard to make. As far as comparing the movie to the book, it's again, from a non-expert's point of view, I would say that the books always have details that movies do not have. But Simon was so incredibly attentive to detail, certainly when it came to portraying Newark. Chancellor Avenue School, right around the corner, was much more pertinent to the young Philip Roth than Weequahic High School. They're both in there. And all the details, I could tell when it was Bergen Street. I could tell when it was supposed to be downtown Newark. So all that is there, Weequahic Park. Whether it was filmed there or not, he did a great job of doing that. But I do think that the types of detail that I would have liked to have seen, and the one that caught my attention, was clearly the antithesis represented by Rabbi Prince, would have been a good thing to include.
But now that
go ahead, Susan. Yeah.
Now that Philip Roth is gone, and our elders are passing, who are the people that are going to tell younger American Jews not to be smug? I remember when I was a little girl, my parents would have parties, and they were very social, and the house had very thin walls, and sometimes the parties would get very quiet, and I could hear them talking with their Jewish friends about who would hide them if the Nazis came, who in their social circle, all the Gentiles they knew, because as American as our family was, and they didn't like to talk about this with us, it was on their mind. So of course I overheard it, so it's on my mind. It was always on Roth's mind, although he's more complicated than that. But American Jews can't get smug.
So one of the things, and you bring that up, and there's the sort of the Englander, the wonderful Nathan Englander story about what we talk about when we talk about Anne Frank, which exactly imagines that scenario, right? I mean, who would hide us if the Nazis came to America, right? And sort of this question that's in the back of Jews' minds historically. There are so many wonderful questions coming in. I had prepared a whole bunch, but I want to make sure to get to audience questions. So I'm going to try to aggregate ones that are in similar categories. And Susan, I'll start with one for you, and I'm going to try to pull a few together. One is to talk about sort of the isolationist politics of the 1930s in terms of what do you think that was Roth, do you think Roth maybe in the TV shows maybe successful at drawing back or pointing back to trends that are lesser known in terms of a previous history of isolationism in the United States? That's one part. And the second part is just to talk a little bit about, and again for Susan, about Charles Lindbergh, how he was received historically from a political perspective, and I'm I recall specifically an early Dr. Seuss cartoon that is kind of an anti-Nazi cartoon that's also an anti-isolationist cartoon that makes fun of Charles Lindbergh as being an isolationist. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about sort of what you think Roth gets right, what the TV show gets right about basically a history of isolationism, America firsters in American politics, and how real this was in terms of something FDR might have been concerned about in the 1930s and early 1940s.
Yeah, it's one of the excellent things about the book and the HBO series is that a lot of Americans, younger Americans especially, don't realize just how strong isolationism was as ideology in the United States before the First World War, in the interwar period, and certainly through all the 1930s. And I think all the people on this call know how reluctant FDR was to get into the Second World War. All the opinion polls read very strongly that Americans didn't want to get into another war. Most Americans, by a pretty large majority, didn't think it was really our business until we were forced in it. And there's plenty of historical retellings of just how much Winston Churchill begged FDR to come in and help them as countries started to fall to the Nazis, and how FDR had to turn them back many times, but we're eventually in. So Roth gets that entirely right. Lindbergh is, he's remembered really, for his courage and flight, not a political figure, and that's the genius of Roth, as turning him into something bigger than he was. The big figures of the 1930s that really would make an impact on somebody like Herman or Bess are, FDR, Huey Long, who, had he not been assassinated in 1935, was a huge threat to Roosevelt from the left, tremendous threat. And then Father Coughlin, who I think people know quite a bit about. So those are your three seminal figures of the 1930s. FDR, by the end of the 30s, because Huey Long is gone, and Coughlin he gets so anti-Semitic that he undercuts his own fame and his own success. But those are the big figures in public discourse of the 30s, more than Lindbergh is, who I think is remembered as not particularly political.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think that the show and the novel points to is sort of the strength of not only isolationism and sort of the America First or nativism of that time period, but also that anti-Semitism, as you allude to, like the radio following that someone like Father Charles Coughlin had, Henry Ford, and when he was publishing the Dearborn Independent, that there was like a very strong anti-Semitic base in America that both Jews had to be aware of, but also FDR, in terms of, so we were talking about this exhibition that's at the Holocaust Museum in Washington called Americans and the Holocaust, which delves very deeply into some of these issues about why America wasn't getting involved initially, why Roosevelt could never make this a war about saving Jews. It had to be a war about defeating fascism and Nazism. And sort of one of the comments came in about sensitivity to public opinion. Public opinion polls in the late 30s and early 40s consistently showed that Americans were, thought that what was happening overseas was really terrible, but they did not want to take in any refugees. They had no interest in getting involved. It was not our problem, right? So there is this sort of very strong kind of island, America's an island, and we're not going to deal with what's going on elsewhere mentality that has very strong roots. And I know we'll get into some of the contemporary relevance here, and there's a number of questions about contemporary relevance that I want to talk about. But before I get to that, I'm going to, there's a number of literary questions so I'm going to turn to Vicki and Aimee to talk about some of the specific questions that are coming in about Philip Roth and the novel. So Erica Dreyfus, hi Erica, asks a couple of questions here. I'm just going to make sure that Aimee and Vicki, are you able to unmute yourselves? Yeah. So Erica asks us a couple of questions that I think you can address. One is, and David Simon talks about this in the podcast, that when he went to ask Philip Roth about adapting the novel to a TV series, one of Roth's only requests was to not call the family the Roth family. That's why the family in the TV series is called the Levin family. That was Roth's request. And Erica asks if you can talk about what's gained and lost from that change, and maybe hearing your thoughts about this. And I'll just ask one other question that's come in. Well, you guys can answer that as I scroll through some of the other questions. So go ahead, Aimee.
So this is just such a small example, but this came up in our preparation meeting. We were thinking about the role of Bess in the series itself. And that got me thinking about the role of Bess, kind of the fantasy of Bess, or kind of the biographical representation of Bess as Roth's mother in his previous works. Patrimony comes to mind. And so what gets lost is kind of this sense of our understanding of Roth's relationship with his mother throughout his canon. Maybe that's less interesting to some of us than others, but I have this kind of memory of Bess that I would love, and reading of Bess, the representation of Bess, that I would love to read into this HBO series. Of course, as Erica has rightly pointed up, we're not to do that, right? This is a fictional family and an alternate history. But Roth has kind of represented his family over decades in a way that allows us to understand them as a part of his tradition as well.
And I think I would only add to that Roth was always conflicted about this. I mean, it was very clear that the novel was based on his own autobiography and that of his family. And in fact, apparently, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but Sandy, his brother, after reading the novel said, "Oh, you made me into a much better artist than I am," and ever was. And Roth said, "Oh, well, it was fiction. It was just fiction." But of course, with Roth, that's always tongue-in-cheek. That's always ironic.
The next question, and I just scrolled up, comes from Sander Goodhart. Also for both of you, I was looking for it before. Asked specifically, what do you make of the fact that the novel goes from the title in chapter 1, Perpetual Fear, to a final chapter titled Perpetual Free? And sort of, what do you think is the perhaps narrative arc? And to broaden it out, but if you want to comment on the Roth aspect, maybe for the rest of you to think about sort of what the novel in the series is talking about, the ideal of freedom in America, and sort of, I will note that the show itself has this sort of tagline, which I had written down. Of course, I can't find right now, about the fragility of freedom in America and the way that democracy needs to always be protected. But maybe comment on perpetual fear to perpetually free, and then the rest of you can think about the idea of freedom as reflected in the novel and the series. Go ahead, Vicki. You're on the screen. You can start. Yeah.
I think that's a really good question, Sandy. And I think with Roth, in many ways, it's always ironic. I mean, that's important that, you're right, the trajectory is important. It's important that it doesn't start with perpetually free and then ends with fear. But I think that we can't read the end without remembering where it started. And so, you know, I can't believe I'm going to say that Roth is more, of all people, more optimistic in that novel than the adaptation of it. But I think that Roth fundamentally believed in, well, as he refers to, in the American moment. There's this really wonderful passage that actually is perfect. I wanted to read this, that Roth wrote in a piece called I Have Fallen in Love with American Names. And he says this: one's, during the time, he was speaking to 1938 to 1946 in particular, for Jews. One's American connection overrode everything. One's American claim was beyond question. Everything had repositioned itself for Jews. There had been a great disturbance to the old rules. One was ready now as never before to stand up to intimidation and the remains of intolerance, and instead of just bearing what one formerly put up with, one was equipped to set foot wherever one chose. The American adventure was one's engulfing fate. And I think that that's where plot ends for Roth, not in the adaptation, but for Roth, I think it ends with, you know, the fear, and fear was not just in America, right? He writes against the backdrop of his grandparents' fear, of the fear that drove immigrant Jews to America. That's always in the backdrop, I think, for Roth. But I think he ended plot with the point of being free, the point of being, to be able to shed that baggage. Now, does Roth ever do it? I think Susan was absolutely right in bringing up Roth's last novel, Nemesis, which is a novel about the polio contagion in the United States, but it's also a novel about the Holocaust. In the backdrop of that novel is the horror that's going on in Europe. And those run parallel, and that's his last novel.
Aimee, do you want to say anything about perpetually fear to free, or?
To underline what Vicki has said, and hi Sandy, I don't see you, but I'm happy you're here. The word, I was focusing my reading on the word fear, but the word perpetual is so important there. Just because you have the word free at the end of the novel doesn't mean the fear goes away. Perpetual fear suggests that the fear is always there. And so one example of that is that moment at the Lincoln Memorial. It's in the novel, but it's also so well done in the series, right? They're all standing looking at this figure of perpetual freedom, the symbol of it, you would hope. At the same time, there's this fear running through every member of the family. So I think they can coexist. I don't know if we can have it both ways, but I always come back to perpetual fear. That for me is the beginning and end of the book. You can say freedom, it just doesn't come to be.
And Susan, what do you think about this sort of overarching theme of the fragility of both freedom and democracy? How do you see this playing out, not only in the novel, but especially in this TV series, viewing it in the current context?
Well, there are lots of parallels, and the producers forced them. You know, they had very much on their mind where we are in American politics. But one of the warnings of so many journalists, novelists, observers of politics and culture across centuries, across countries, is that it's all about the media. When authoritarian or totalitarian government leaders or wannabe leaders are trying to make progress, they're usually trying to grab the means of communication or manipulate it somehow. Yes, we have freedom of speech. We think it's very well protected, but the truth is that it's pretty easy to block journalists from getting information and from being able to report it. I mean, journalists always have this problem. The press always has this problem where if they are critical of a leader, a candidate, a government, they won't get access, and then we won't have access. So I think one of the threads that you can pull through American history, certainly through the 1930s all the way to the present, is, you know, keep your eye on what kind of access the media have to government, what we're able to learn in a democracy, and who controls the means of communication. I mean, in the 1930s, Father Coughlin obviously used radio to great effect, as did Hitler, as did Mussolini, as did FDR. And Huey Long was great at it too, but again, he was assassinated before he could get the kind of traction he absolutely would have gotten from the left. So as you worry about American politics, you've got to watch the media, you got to watch communications, even more so than the courts in many ways, because they have codified authority that the media really don't.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the points that really brings it up to the present moment in particular as we think about this. And I do want to get to that, but I want to direct a question towards Stuart, and then the rest of you can also comment on this as well. So one of the major themes that comes through both in the novel, but especially in the TV series, is there's a spectrum of Jewish responses to persecution, and you can see it in particular in sort of the strong male characters that are represented in the novel, and especially in the TV series. You have the character of Herman, who's always angry, and there is a question, Vicky, from one of your former students about the way that Herman is adapted, whether that you like the way or sort of agree with the way he's adapted. But Herman comes through as angry and sort of as yelling at the radio constantly, right? Like that's how he channels his expression. Alvin, who is really adapted and takes on much more of a life in the TV series than he does in the novel, is kind of the emblem of Jewish resistance, the one who has a drive to fight back and to take revenge on Nazis in particular. And then you have this character of Rabbi Bengelsdorf, who in some ways is a real focus, and David Simon talks about this too, and he keeps alluding to Bengelsdorf as kind of a Rumkowski type character, right? Somebody who is complicit, who maybe sees an opportunity, in aligning himself with the government. He's an opportunist. But I'm wondering, and maybe Stuart, you want to start with this, sort of what this says about the way in which Jews relate to power, can relate as a minority group to those in power. What is an effective type of response in a situation like this, and how you see this depicted in the series?
Well, I'm going to tie this together with a couple of thoughts about fear, if that's okay.
Sure.
And I'd like to start by saying that there's a reason I'm an ancient historian. I like to deal with very dead people rather than be relevant. Everybody's an expert on today. Having said that, I remember when I read the book that the one scene that I remember was something along the lines of Nazis invading Summit Avenue, and that just stuck with me for years. I lived not far from Summit Avenue, a very different kind of neighborhood, Lower Chancellor Avenue. In one of his books, Roth says, well, that's where all the rich doctors live. It may have been in his day, but it wasn't true when I lived there. But still, Summit Avenue wasn't that far away. It was walkable. And the idea of the fear came off the page is what I'm saying. And I could very easily see those same Nazis making their way down to Lower Chancellor Avenue, to the more elite neighborhood in Roth's mind. So with that in mind, about power, I don't really deal with power. Well, I do actually. In antiquity, in the ancient world, and what I'm interested in is moving away from the idea that persecution somehow identifies who Jews are. I'm much more interested in real Jews, not just the Jews that come off the page of the Talmud, the rabbis, leading Jews, whoever they were, but commoners, real Jews that you have to read against the grain to learn more about. I guess that's why I'm looking for other Jews in Roth's writings than the ones he's talking about directly. And I think that it's the lives of those Jews, in my mind, a lot of their personal domestic life, communal life, that says so much about how Jews survive than anything else. And I've never thought really about how, I haven't taken it to the point of thinking about this in terms of modernity, or at least the more contemporary world. But I think that there's a whole lot more to survival than just having power as a response to persecution. But having power always is nice when it is a time of persecution.
Yeah, there is a real sort of divide in terms of how he depicts and how the show depicts these characters in particular. One of the things that also comes through is the way in which the state is able to basically begin to break apart the family dynamic, the nuclear family dynamic. You know, Herman is so focused on his anger, but at the same time you can see the family starting to break down as Sandy is taken away from the family, and you know, sort of Alvin goes off and does his own thing, and it's really Bess who is left to try to keep the family together in some way, which I think comes through in a very strong way in the novel and in this TV series. And I'll say one thing, you know, there are these allusions to historical characters like a Judah P. Benjamin as an example, you know, sort of examples of Jews or court Jews, examples of Jews throughout history who have tried to, you know, ally themselves with those in power in order to sort of do what they think they're doing in the best interest of the community. And I think Roth is very strongly critical of those who get sort of naively fall under the sway and forget who they are in some sense. Vicky, I don't know if you want to jump in and say anything about specifically the Herman character, or just more broadly about these both the male and the female characters, the way they're adapted.
You know, to pick up on, I will, but to pick up on something you just said, Roth was always censored that position of Jews who pretended not to be Jews, who believed that the only way to assimilate was to not be Jewish, to look like the Gentiles, right? I mean, that was the case in from that very first collection of stories, from Goodbye Columbus and Eli the Fanatic. It has always been Roth's posture from the very beginning. But in terms of Herman, I mean, I liked the way in which Herman appeared in the adaptation. I think he was a stronger character. I think he was true to form. I mean, Herman is representative of the first generation American-born Jew who believed in America and believed that America was, to borrow a phrase from Roth, good for the Jews. And Herman loses something. I mean, Herman loses that belief. That's it, and for him, remember that, of course, fear and anger are very close. So Herman reacts with such anger because he is so frightened and because he feels so disenfranchised, and he's frightened for his family. And so I thought that he was really done well. I thought that Bess was also portrayed really well, and I think they both. My read about this is, you're right, that Bess wants to go to Canada. Bess is aware that things do not look good in America for Jews, and that they're going to get worse, and that they need to get out. Herman is so entrenched and he's hanging on, but both are reacting to fear, and both are reacting to protect the family in different ways.
Yeah, no, I think it comes through very clearly. And I have to say that the acting, you know, we can critique the sort of transition, but I think it's really masterful, the sort of adaptation and the level of thought. And as Stuart was alluding to, the detail that the producers went to really both try to create sort of an authentic image of Newark. There was a question here about sort of how authentic that Newark was, and Stuart talked about it, or comparing it to Jersey City of that time, these Jewish neighborhoods. I mean, they really, really went to great lengths. And the casting really was brilliant, and not all Jewish actors. You know, we have Turturro playing an assimilated rabbi, and Zoe Kazan, who's not Jewish, but is the granddaughter of Elia Kazan, is amazing as Bess. And Winona Ryder, who is Jewish, plays you know, Evelyn. So it's really, really well done. I do want to, I'm aware of the time, and so I'm going to make this the last question, even though we've had some really excellent questions in the chat, and they will be saved for posterity because we're recording this. And but the last question is one that I'll direct to Aimee to start, but I want everyone to jump in and address this. And that's really where you ended up, Aimee, in your comments, which is to bring it up to the present moment and sort of think about what Roth was writing about in 2004, what this tells us about the history of American politics in the 1930s and 1940s, but also very much about what this tells us about our present day, which the producers of the series were very aware of sort of what the present day, what, you know, that they were running the show in the spring of an election year in 2020, even to the point, and sorry as a spoiler for those who haven't seen the show, that at the, you know, the last scene, you have Herman sitting listening to the election returns coming in. And unlike the novel where FDR comes back in 1942 in a special election, we don't know what's going to happen in the election at the end of the TV series. It sort of fades to a bright orange glow on the radio dial, and it's very obvious what the creators of the TV series are trying to do. So I just wonder if each of you can comment sort of what you see as you're watching this show through the lens of the present moment, which, and both in one of the questions that came in about rereading the novel and how reading it again today, it's more terrifying than it was, you know, reading it in 2004. So Aimee, why don't you start, and then we'll go Susan and Vicky and Stuart. Unmuted. You're unmuted.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. And I can tie it to something I think maybe Erica or someone else asked about in the chat, which is to read the novel as a novel contemporary to its day means to read it as a novel published in 2004, which I would imagine had no kind of fantasy or kind of nightmarish sense that our current president would rise to power, and then to read it in the current day, which is the election of 2016. So to go back to 2004, the question was often, was Roth writing a critique of the George W. Bush America, the kind of botched politics after 9/11? And Roth said, no, that was never on my mind. I was interested more in the Selden Wishnows and American democracy, the American project. So he disavowed that. And the other contemporary age or day, which is 2020, and looking back over the last 4 years, makes it seem like it's this uncanny prediction. And I would say that Simon really ratcheted that up, right? So kind of there were questions about the people in the episodes 5 and 6 are saying, where is the leadership, right? And also with the references to voter fraud, voter tampering, burning ballots in a democratic election, suggests that Simon wants to take Roth's 2004 vision of America and update it for 2020 to show us that we could be going down even a path that's darker than what Roth originally represented.
Susan, how do you see it from the lens of today?
Well, I think one of our bigger issues today, there are so many, is what is the truth? What are facts? I mean, that's what I think all of us think about most days here in 2020. And I think what Roth wants us to struggle with, and what the characters struggle with, is that Lindbergh and the First Lady are spouting a lot of nonsense that's not factual. A lot of people are spouting nonsense in the show, and it's Bengelsdorf, I think, is supposed to be the mediator of facts. He's supposed to be translating what the president, First Lady are saying into something that seems factual, seems understandable, seems right, seems fair, and he has a lot of trouble being that intermediary. But facts are socially constructed, I think, is the argument of the book and the film, and that people make a mess of them. They really do. They stretch them and pull them and push them into shapes that suit their agenda. And so you see that going on in Plot Against America, and you see it going on here today. So that social construction of reality that is done so beautifully in the HBO series is what we live all the time.
Thank you. Vicki.
Well, yeah, I agree with both what Aimee and Susan said. In an interview, David Simon said that the question he was asked was, could he speak to the way in which he adapted the ending to our contemporary moment? And he said, the future of the country seems to be much more open-ended than I think even when Roth wrote the book in 2004. And indeed, I think that's right. And I think he gets at it really well at the end. I found the end, I found the adaptation itself, the HBO series itself, far more frightening than the novel. Now, in part, of course, because with the novel, we know how the historical past played out. We don't know how the future will play out for us. And of course, remember what happened to Lot's wife. Looking back is not always a good thing to do. And maybe I would just end before Stuart speaks with what I think might be an epigraph for our time, and it comes from another novel of Roth. It comes from Everyman, where the narrator says this: there's no remaking reality. Just take it as it comes, hold your ground, and take it as it comes.
Thank you. Stuart.
Oh, I don't know if there's a whole lot I can add to that. I especially liked Amy's remarks, but everybody else, Susan and Vicki, only amplified them. All I can say is, again, as an ancient historian, I'm much more comfortable talking about the past than the present. I do have fears concerns. I must say over the last 7 weeks since I haven't been driving at all, it's been a good time for me because, in a certain sense, because I haven't found myself screaming at the radio as I was earlier. But my concern is about our culture more than anything else. We've alluded to the government and politics and so on and so forth, but as a professor, as an academic, over the last few years, I found myself questioning what it is we're accomplishing in the classroom when our culture is so challenged, when it comes to facts, truth, analysis. It's not so much where you're coming from politically as how you get there. And that really is what I think about a whole lot. And I'd like to end on a more hopeful note than that, but that's all I have to say, I think.
Yeah. And I'll just conclude by agreeing with all of my fellow panelists and your sort of brilliant insights about sort of the fragility of democracy, the fragility of freedom, how precious the truth is, and also how terrifying it is to watch a show like this right now, which, as Aimee, as you pointed out, this is an alternate history. This is not what happened in history. And yet I, until Susan said, hey, should we do a panel on this, was avoiding watching the show because I knew that it would be terrifying. And thank you to Susan for suggesting that we do this panel, because it forced me to re-engage with this. And in a way, I think that's kind of where I want to end up, which is that we cannot turn away, that we have an obligation to engage and to stay engaged. And that's the only way that any of this works, right? Participatory democracy relies on participation, and it relies on people continuing to remain engaged. I'll say as a historian, kind of living through the current moment, and here I think not only about the current political moment, but the living through this pandemic and sort of the idea of what we don't know and how terrifying that is. There is a line in the novel which really jumped out at me, and that's, I'll just read it briefly. Roth writes, as Lindbergh's election couldn't have made clearer to me, the unfolding of the unforeseen was everything. Turned wrong way round, the relentless unforeseen was what we school children studied as history, that is history with a capital H, harmless history where everything unexpected in its own time is chronicled on the page as inevitable. The terror of the unforeseen is what the science of history hides, turning a disaster into an epic. And I'll just say that this is an amazing insight from Roth, especially for a historian, where we can get everything organized and we know how it's going to turn out, and there is some reassuring aspect to it. And it's the terror of the unforeseen that is so unsettling when we can't get it all organized. So that being said, we have to continue to stay engaged, not put our heads down, remain optimistic. And I want to thank all of you, all of our panelists, for a wonderful discussion, and really everyone who joined this program, close to 200 people, plus however many were behind their screens. So thank you all for joining us this evening. You really helped to make this a wonderful program. Stay safe, stay healthy, sei gesund, and we will hope to see you soon. Be well.
Thank you.